summarizing the verse of the Quran 64:8, it says, "Therefore have faith in Allah and His Messenger, and in the light which we have sent down." Al-Ghazali writes that it is appropriate for the Quran to be named the light, just as the light of the sun is named the light. The Quran is like the light of the sun. So it should come as no surprise then that beginning in the 12th, 13th centuries, throughout all the Muslim world, the primary decoration on the bindings and the cover pages of Quranic manuscripts was geometric composition that many art historians refer to as a star, but which we now have compelling reasons to call a sun. Because in the end, this type of decorative element found on the pages of handwritten Quran is known as shams. It can be translated as a little sun. And evidently, the practice of decorating the Quran with the sunshine, and thereby creating a symbolic link between the sun and the divine, was well established in Al-Andalus before the Christian conquest. This is demonstrated by remarkable manuscripts, such as the one produced in Seville, in the early 13th century. This is another one from the 14th century, made in Nasri, Granada. And it is therefore reasonable to believe that both in medieval Egypt and the Iberian Peninsula, there existed a traditional symbolical link in the sun and the sunlight with Allah, with His message conveyed through Muhammad, and with the foundational principle, one of the foundational principles of Islam, the monotheism, the oneness of Allah as the Tawhid. And this idea has been noted on numerous occasions by scholars of Islamic thought and symbolism. For example, Malik Shebel, who maintained that the sun was the true embodiment of a Tawhid in Islamic thinking in this period. Now, long before him, also the ever fascinating and controversial Aiman, which was known as Al-Wahid Yahya after his conversion to Islam, who held that the sun was the symbol par excellence of divine oneness. And furthermore, the composition featuring star shape or sun shape body at the center from which other geometric forms emerge and radiate onward constitutes an almost perfect visual analogy for the principle of oneness, the essential being from which everything originates, unfolds, and projects itself into the universe. Crucially, this is achieved without resorting to iconographic or narrative methods that would have conflicted with the theological traditions and interpretations prevailing both in Al-Andalus and medieval Egypt, since those traditions were, it is well known, deeply resistant to translating the divine message into images susceptible to idolatrous interpretations. And yet, a medieval Muslim scholar, well versed in the Quran, the Hadith, and Islamic law, would undoubtedly interpret the analogy between a geometric form and the idea of divine oneness as precisely that, an analogy, not to real presence, the kind accepted in Christian art and its sacred image. Hence, the philosopher Al-Jurjani asserted in the 11th century similarities between objects and abstract ideas do not arise from direct relationships between them, but rather from correlations among their respective attributes. However, this nuanced understanding was not necessarily shared by the Christian communities that appropriated Islamic art, the Coptic minority in Egypt and the Christian majority on the Iberian Peninsula, who, despite having conquered Al-Andalus, continued to go deeply on its artistic traditions. As is well known, the relationship between image and narrative is far more direct in Christian art, and purely symbolic allusion to God through an abstract geometric form was probably insufficient to fulfill the visual and liturgical function required by Christian practice. For this reason, in both traditions, the sun-shaped forms sometimes appear alongside other elements that clarify the Christian meaning for believers. Coptic craftsmen and patrons devise a particularly elegant and subtle solution. They often manipulate the geometry to insert crosses between the star shape and subtly introduce cross motifs within the designs. As can be seen in this screen from St. Barbara in Cairo, that a comparable technique appears in certain Iberian tabernacle doors, where the geometry of the star is shifted laterally so as to form a Greek cross at the center instead of a sun or star. Yet the methods used to Christianize, so to speak, this geometric vocabulary were sometimes more direct and less subtle. One extraordinary example from the Iberian Peninsula is found on the 14th century tabernacle doors of Seville Cathedral. At the time these doors were made, the building was still a converted great mosque, and the city's Andalusian cultural past remained very much visible in the urban landscape surrounding. In the center of each of the signs of these doors, the word Allah was engraved in Gothic script. The cathedral's canon and priests who commissioned this work undoubtedly understood the symbolic significance that the geometric representation of the sun held in abundance. By inscribing the word Allah at its center, they developed a form of symbolic representation of the abstract divine that was almost entirely foreign to the visual tradition of Christian art, which had relied from its very beginning on figurative and narrative imagery. And however, as Mircea Eliade, the great historian of religion, stated in his famous book, The Sacred and the Profane, when referring to the symbolism of the sun in the monotheistic religions of the Mediterranean, a religious symbol conveys its message even if it's no longer consciously understood in all its aspects. And in conclusion, I have presented how two geographically distant and socially distinct Christian communities, the Copts and the Christians of the Iberian Peninsula, independently produce material objects that are strikingly similar in both function and appearance for the celebration of the Eucharist. Wooden structures decorated with sun-shaped geometric patterns and liturgical inscriptions bearing profound symbolic significance, created without any contact between the two communities. A significant outcome of this comparative analysis is that the assimilation of Islamic art by the communities was not merely aesthetic or imitative, but rather responded to shared symbolic logics. In both medieval Egypt and the Iberian Peninsula, Christian artisans and patrons recognized Islamic geometry as a visual language capable of expressing fundamental theological concepts, particularly the relationship between the divine and life, that transcended religious and cultural boundaries. It is also important to acknowledge a fundamental difference in historical and social conditions underlying these two processes of assimilation. The Copts operated as a minority community under conditions of growing religious and political pressure during the Ayyubid and Mameluid dynasties, and this context meant that their adoption of Islamic geometry patterns was probably, at least in part, an adaptation to the constraints imposed by the dominant cultural environment. The Iberian Christians, on the other hand, occupied the position of a conquering power, yet they did not break with the visual tradition they encountered in the territories they absorbed. The two situations, opposite in terms of power, led to a surprisingly converging formal outcome. And ultimately, this comparative analysis invites us to reconsider the question posed at the beginning of my presentation. The similarities between Iberian Tabernacle and Coptic sanctuary scripts and Nigerian not the product of a direct influence. They are rather the result of two parallel processes of symbolic appropriation of Islamic art in the service of Christian Eucharistic liturgy. Far from representing two radically different forms of assimilation, what these books reveal is the existence of shared human attitudes and visual strategies that transcend geographical, confessional, and disciplinary boundaries. What remains open, however, is the question whether this convergence stems solely from the intrinsic symbolic power of Islamic geometry, or whether there exists some as yet unidentified channel of cultural transmission that might account for it. And this is precisely the line of inquiry that will guide my future research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. You're dealing here with a very sensitive topic, which is symbolism in Islamic art, because it has been always discussed and it has been always attracting the attention, but it has never been proved that any of the motives in Islamic art carry a symbolic meaning. It has never been proved because we don't have any reference from artists. We don't have any reference that they are assimilating between, for example, the star pattern and the sun. And by the way, this was not only mentioned regarding the star pattern, it was also mentioned regarding the radiating inscription. You know that the radiating inscription attracted also the attention of many scholars, and some of them assimilated that with the sun. And this is really looks like the sun with the rays of the letters, the rays of the strokes of the letters like alif, lam, kaf, and so on. And in some cases, for example, in the table of the Prophet Muhammad ibn Khazawun, they found the radiating inscription with the name of Muhammad in the center. So they said this is a star pattern, this is a symbol of the sun, and the name of Muhammad, and Nasr Muhammad is trying to assimilate himself with the Prophet Muhammad, and this was way much exaggeration. And so we have nothing proved about the symbolism of different patterns in Islamic art. So building on this, I believe still needs more discussion. And another thing that I want to add is the mobility in the Mediterranean region, because scholars, craftsmen, and artists have been always moving around in the Mediterranean region. So that's why we see, especially during the Fatimid period, some similar decorative motifs that have been that appeared in Sicily and in Italy, and similarly in Spain.
Is documented?
What do you mean?
Are those documented?
No, the motifs themselves.
No, the migration of the motifs.
Some of them, yes. Yeah, some of them, yes. But it is still very interesting to compare between those different motifs. And I know that symbolism is very strong in Christianity and in Coptic arts.
I'm basically talking to answer your question about Christian art.
Yes.
That's my trip. I'm talking about Christian art. I'm not talking about
I'm
Islamic
sure.
art.
Yes.
I'm talking about how Christians interpret Islamic art. The fact that you find the word Allah in a Christian word and not in an Islamic word, that's a strong sign of how they interpret. Putting the name Allah inside a form is very rare to find in Islamic word. You can find it. It is very rare. But the Christian, this is an interpretation of how the Christians understood what they were seeing in the Muslim communities. This is not Islamic art.
That's very good, because that now you are maybe clarifying what maybe I didn't understand correctly. So this does not mean that the Islamic art is interpreting this.
I myself, personally as a scholar, I'm convinced that Islamic art is evolved. Completely convinced.
Okay.
And that's an opinion,
That's
a
your
scholarly opinion that
Yes.
is debatable, but and probably we don't have the time. We could discuss wrongly about this, but I am personally convinced that Islamic art can be, not that it's symbolic, but can be symbolic, which is an important nuance. Can be, not that is, can be, which is can be used to convey symbolic meaning. And this is why I cited Michelia, because the symbol, even if the meaning, original meaning of the symbol is lost, even if this change, the message is still there. I don't know if I'm making myself pretty clear. So Islamic art can be, because a lot, I could talk to you about a lot of examples all around the Mediterranean in which we find clear symbolic intention in Islamic art. Sometimes not, sometimes it's to find the stars, to find the suns, it's just shapes, it's just decoration. But sometimes they are not. And they clearly have a symbolic. The person designing that objects, he was infusing a clear symbolic meaning to the object.
There are many studies about this, but
Yeah.
we have different points of
Yeah.
view.
Well, thank you for this very interesting presentation, and thank you for the discussion. I know it's always rising a lot of debate when we come to sacred geometry. I'm also very divided because I strongly believe that there is some symbolism. In my cosmic geometry expresses numbers, and numbers, the 3, 4, the 5, they have a meaning, regardless of the religion. Exists in Islam. And so if I imagine I'm a craftsman and I'm sitting there and I want to cover a surface by some geometrical pattern, and what I have is the compass and the ruler, I start with the circle. The circle is perfect. What is perfect? It's God. So and then you start to divide the whole thing, go by 3, by 4, by 6. I think it's the way to express yourself. An artist wants to express his belief or whatever he feels. But then I also think that the star or sun pattern will enter the vocabulary of architecture that is reproduced without asking what is the meaning behind, or without knowing or understanding the symbolism, but just something that, okay, it comes in handy to cover big surfaces. So I think we have to, but I still believe that the meaning is there, like original.
I agree. It depends on the person using the shape. That's the best. But again, I would like to repeat, this is Christian art. This is not Islamic art.
Yes,
This is Christian doing Christian art with Islamic originated shapes. So have that in mind. This Christian thinking as Christian.
and it's regional because, like in Egypt, Christians and Muslims, they live together, and there's some other than religious things that connect the people in their perspective of the world and of arts.
And again, another thing that I didn't mention, in Egypt, in the Iberian Peninsula for sure, but I think in Egypt too, these pieces were made in the same workshops. They were made in the same workshops. So they worked for both Christians and Muslims. So that's another, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, for the questions, and thank you so much, Louis, for the presentation. We will have for sure more time again for more discussion.